Okay, so the first topic we're going to look at is liberalism. We're going to look at what is it, why are we doing it first? Well, we're going to do it first because, in a sense, it's the oldest. The thinkers go back the longest, and in another sense, actually, liberalism gave birth to all the other ideologies. So when people start to think about how to organise life past kings and queens and God, etc. Liberalism was the kind of first one to tackle those big questions. So let's make a start. Okay, so how did liberalism come about? Well, in a way, you've got to understand what liberalism or liberal thinkers were sort of fighting against, or what they were trying to establish. So let's think about it. In the kind of 16th, 17th century, most people ruled on the basis of a divine right. Okay, so divine right of kings, i.e., you've got to obey me, and I am legitimate because God wants me to be on the throne, and He wants me to order you around, or chuck you in jail, or cut your head off, or whatever it is. To illustrate this, let's have a little look at a little story. Okay, so Battle of Hastings. As we all know, 1066, the English throne is suddenly free because a king called Edward has died. There are various pretenders to the throne, but let's concentrate on William the Conqueror and Harold Godwin. Okay, here's a picture of William, nice looking crown, looks very regal, and there you go, there's Harold Godwin, also got a very kingly moustache and a nice crown on him there. Now, let's think about which of these leaders should be king. William is a duke, I think, from Normandy. He speaks French. He lives in Normandy. He's got across the sea, etc., etc. Whereas Harold is an Anglo-Saxon king, speaks English, is living. I don't know if he's living in London or not, but he's supported by like the lords and ladies and the people of London. So you think, well, it's got to be Harold, really, isn't he? He's the legitimate ruler. Well, how do you get around this? So William basically claims that Edward has promised him the throne of England on some relics. Okay, and that's a picture of a relic right there. So that is that's some saint's bones in a box. Okay, very, very holy. And if you make a kind of promise to someone on that, it's like saying mums. All right, it's like a big promise. Okay, so he then goes to the Pope, who's the head of the church, also a very powerful figure in medieval times. And he says, look, will you support my claim? And if the Pope says yes, that means God supports your claim. Okay, so, and the Pope says yes. He gives him the papal banner, and William goes off and actually attracts a lot of people to fight for him because basically God is on his side. Okay. Now, why does he do this? Well, potentially he believes that he wants God on his side and he needs the luck and he needs God to win the battle, but also he needs to be seen as legitimate as well. And if God is on your side, you are legitimate. Okay, so basically legitimacy is divinely given. Okay, so liberalism starts to question that. All right. So liberalism is the first kind of ideology that stresses tolerance, rationality, and freedom. Okay, so liberalism is the idea that actually some parts of mankind aren't inherently superior to the others. Okay, so kings and aristocrats aren't inherently superior. So rationalism and the idea of equality within mankind inspired thinkers such as John Locke and another guy we haven't really looked at yet called Thomas Paine to search for new sources of authority. Okay, so if it's not God, who is it, or what is it? You've got to think as well that not only the context of the sort of divine right of kings, but also liberalism starts off in a period that we call the Enlightenment. And you see, I'll give you a picture there of lots of scientific tools and whatever. So it's a period of rationality and experimentation and science. Okay, what makes that difference from the previous before? Well, the knowledge used to be based on the idea that you could look to the scriptures for anything. If you wanted an answer to something, it was in the Bible, or it was your priest knew it, or the Pope knew it. Okay, that world was crumbling, and people have started to say, well, actually, we can find out the answers through reason and rationality and using our own brains, etc. So that is also a big sort of pillar that propped up liberalism. Okay, let's have a little look at what a famous sort of quote that we're going to return to at the end of the video. So this is the Declaration of Independence in 1776. This is when the American colonies decided that they would throw off the rule of England, and England at the time, you've got to remember, was ruled by a monarch. Okay. And it says this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so you can see already that people are thinking, actually, men are created equal. They have God is in this. It's interesting that God is still in this, but that God has given them certain unalienable rights, that all men are equal in front of God, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we're going to return to that at the end to see how liberalism allowed people all of those sort of three rights, if you want. Maybe the most interesting one being the last one, the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so let's start with individualism. So first and foremost, before the Enlightenment and before the birth of liberalism, the individual wasn't terribly important. Certain individuals were, like kings and pharaohs and people and aristocrats and people like that, but the idea that the individual was special and unique and had rights was not thought of. You know, it was thought of in terms of, can you build me this pyramid, can you bring in my crops for me, etc, etc. Okay, so we start to see the individual as emerging as an important concept, and probably the first philosopher to deal with this in any way, like important way, was a German philosopher called Kant, okay, or Immanuel Kant. Okay, here's a picture of him. There's his big shiny forehead and all the special things going on inside. Okay, so he says Kant was actually interested in how you can have morality without religion. Okay, so he basically built up a system of thought that we describe as ethics, that tried to describe how morality should come about and the morals that we should live by, but without that don't need to be directed from God, i.e. commandments start, thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that. Okay, and one of the things that Kant came up with, he said that actually individuals are unique and in some sense special, and they should never be treated as ends. They should be treated as ends and not means. Okay, so what that means is that an individual should be treated as kind of special. You should treat individuals as you treat yourself. Okay, so you shouldn't use someone else to further your own gains. Okay, and this was one of the things that Kant described as a categorical imperative. Okay, so he said certain acts should be performed by them for themselves and not because of either because you're trying to get into heaven or because you're trying to make some gain in some way. Okay, so another categorical imperative of his, I think, was to tell the truth. Okay, so that was another thing for Kant, but he put, as you can see with that first thing, that individuals are ends and not means. He put the individual, gave it a sort of special place, the individual, where it maybe had none before. Okay, this sort of takes us to a little bit of a split, which we're going to come into in the next video. So there's actually two kinds of individualism. Okay, so there's egoistic individualism, where this is like a classical liberal key term, where they say actually it's only the individual is important, and as just they should be left alone as much as possible. They're self-seeking and self-reliant. And then the other one, which is developmental individualism, which is the idea that actually individuals should have the chance to sort of build up their potential, etc. Okay, but don't worry about that too much for the time being. All you need to know is that the individual is suddenly given some weight and some power in the political landscape. Okay, the next idea, so if you start to think that the individual is important, how do you deal with a problem where you're an individual but you live in a world of lots of other individuals and actually they might believe or act or appear in lots of different ways to you. Okay, and that comes to so that leads on to a sort of the next kind of key concept within liberalism, and that's the idea of tolerance. So Locke believed that tolerance was actually very important, and he believed this for three reasons. Okay, now when Locke was around, the main source of intolerance was religion, and Catholics and Protestants were loving killing each other at this time, and they were just having a good old time doing that. So and Locke said, look, this is wrong. You can't. What's the point in trying to force your belief onto other people? And he believed in tolerance for three, I think, very good reasons. Okay, his first reason was that no earthly judge can adequately judge a religion or a competing truth claim of a religion. Okay, so he says that actually, look, we're talking about divine principles here, but yet we ourselves are mortal earthly judges. So we haven't got the capacity to do that. Secondly, and this is also a very good point, I think, is that no one can be forced to believe something. Okay, so the principle of intolerance, I suppose, is the idea that I am right and you are wrong. Okay, so no one could be forced to believe something that they don't believe. Okay, and the last one is actually a sort of more practical point, is that actually trying to force people to believe something leads to more disorder than just allowing diversity. So he says actually tolerance is important, but if you can see, it's also connected to the idea of an individual. If you respect the individual, you also tolerant, because you say, okay, I'm this, you're that, I'll just allow it. Okay. Oh yes. So the idea of tolerance now, how do we connect this to the modern kind of day? Well, the idea of tolerance used to be used for religion, like Catholics, Protestants, Guy Fawkes trying to blow out the Houses of Parliament, all that kind of stuff. Okay, it's now used to apply to all manner of issues. So that could be homosexuality, it could be transgendered issues, it could be gender issues, it could be race, it could be whatever it is. Okay, the idea is that the individual is respected over everything. Okay, so let's deal with the next, I don't know, maybe the most important concept or principle for liberals. Okay, in fact, if you think about it, liberal is kind of similar to the word liberty and freedom, and that's the thing that they care about most. So let's call freedom kind of the most important of all liberal values. But what does it mean? Well, initially, for liberals, freedom meant being released from the arbitrary rule of kings, authoritarian governments, and tyrants. So you just say, look, as long as you are not just ruling me with an iron fist based on some spurious claim about God, then I'm happy. What does that mean? Does that mean that they think that we should just be able to do anything all the time in a sort of weird purge style scenario? Well, they didn't believe in that either. So they thought, so what did they believe in? Well, initially, yeah, they wanted freedom from this kind of arbitrary rules. Later, liberals actually thought that this freedom was a good in itself. So they said that the actions of each individual pursue amounted to a kind of collective good. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So first of all, there was Jeremy Bentham, and he was a thinker that is not one of our core thinkers, but he was very important nonetheless, and a sort of teacher of John Stuart Mill. And he came up with this idea of utilitarianism. So he said man is rational, and so his answer to the question of how should we organise society would be that we should have the greatest good for the greatest number. So if something brought the greatest number of people happiness, then that's what we should pursue. Okay, so i.e. People following their desires leads to the common good. The next person who thought that was a guy called Adam Smith, and he thought actually people pursuing their interest in a sort of free way would actually be good for the economy and would make nations themselves more wealthy. In his book The Wealth of Nations, he argues that everyone pursuing their own sort of goals will make the world a better place. So if the baker bakes bread and the butcher slaughters and cuts up the meat, and each are doing it for profit, but actually each in turn kind of build society and make us all more prosperous, even though they're sort of doing it for themselves. John Stuart Mill was the sort of maybe one of the first ones to kind of really put his finger on exactly what freedom should mean, and his definition was the harm principle. So when we do the thinkers, we'll go into this in a bit more detail, but he said basically you should be free to do anything as long as it does not harm others, and obviously lots of our actions would harm others and the purge would be out, but he called this negative freedom. So you're allowed to do anything unless it harms others, in which case you shouldn't be allowed to do it. Now later liberals, as we know, kind of expanded this idea of freedom. So there's a guy called T.H. Green, and he says that people also work towards a common good and benefit from a common good. So an idea that would be something like we could, as a society, build an education system, and people will work towards that, and then people will always also benefit from that. And we call that positive freedom. So it's a sort of larger definition of freedom. Okay. So let's look at what liberals think about the state then, because if they're so concerned about freedom, what do they think about this thing that's going to constrain individuals and charge them taxes and lay down laws and all that sort of stuff? So it's described in our textbook as the state is a necessary evil. But what does this mean? Well, if you think about it, liberalism sort of coincided with the start of modern industrial society, so things start to get more complicated. We're not all out in the fields anymore, and things need to be managed, so you kind of need a state. However, at the same time, liberals are worried about, they're quite positive about human nature, but they're worried about when you give power to humans. So there's a very famous quote by Lord Acton, says that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So on one hand, that they're saying that we need a state. On the other hand, they're saying if you give a state to an individual, there's a chance that they might become a tyrant, or like the kings that we're trying to get rid of. So what do? So liberals are fans of constitutionalism, i.e. having a constitution that limits government and hopefully gives people a Bill of Rights. And let's just remind ourselves how they do that. So most constitutions separate powers like this. So you have a legislative branch, you have, which is like Congress in America, you have an executive branch, which is like the president and the White House and the departments in America, and then you have the judicial branch, which is the high courts and actually the whole court system, and they interpret the law. The executive proposes and enforces the law, and the legislative branch actually passes the law. So the idea is that no one of these branches has too much power. Okay, so as we know, President Trump has been limited in what he can do because either Congress is blocking him or the courts are challenging him, and so power isn't too concentrated, and therefore it's a limit on power. And they also like a Bill of Rights, so they like rights to be entrenched and something that can't be changed easily from government to government. Okay, so now that said, there's a kind of, when it comes to the state, we're also talking about managing the economy. So, and there's two sort of lines of thought here. There's economic liberalism, and as we touched on already, you've got Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nation. And they basically says he basically says, look, you want as much liberalism in the economy as possible, but you still need the state there to enforce certain things like property contracts and stuff like that. This comes down to essentially there's a real balance for liberals between equality and freedom. And that is the essential tension in liberalism. So if you give people complete freedom, particularly in the economic sphere, then you can an individual can accrue vast amounts of wealth, and obviously that has a big impact on equality. If you enforce equality, i.e. through regulation and heavy taxation and stuff like that, that limits people's freedom or maybe their incentive to work, etc., etc. So there's an essential tension between that. And to give you an idea of one person who is very much at one end of the spectrum, so like, well, he's a neoliberal, but we would call him a classical liberal as well, a guy called Milton Friedman, who there's a quote here from him there, says, a society that tries to achieve equality will end up with neither. Okay, but as we will see later on, modern liberals very much believe that you can, that freedom itself is you need a certain amount of equality to achieve freedom. Okay, so this takes us to the next suppose, pillar, if you like, of liberalism, and also maybe how liberals view human nature. So liberals liberalism, sort of growing as it is in the Enlightenment, tend to think that humanity is rational. So human rationality is kind of at the heart of Enlightenment thinking. If you remember, Enlightenment is this time where we start to shake off religious doctrine and dogma, and we start to believe in science and the ability of human reason to come up with solutions and to guide our lives, I suppose. So if you think about it, if humans are rational and able to select their own true course, they should be allowed to do so. So liberals believe they might not always make the right choices, but it's better for them to take responsibility than kind of receive instructions from above. So they believed it was better for the individual and better for society. Rationality also. So if you start to believe that people are rational and capable of sort of pushing their own lives forward, it also sort of leads you to a belief in democracy, but also for the belief in dialogue, for the resolution of conflict. And you also kind of recognize this, I think, a little bit from global politics, from liberals, that they like to get together and they like to support kind of intergovernmental activities where people talk their problems through as opposed to fighting them out. So liberals originally supported the League of Nations, and we know from global that they also support the UN and the EU. Okay, so what about equality and social justice? So right now, this far I've talked quite a lot about freedom, but there's also some sort of justice in that, I suppose. So this is where the splits start to occur for liberals. So traditionally, liberals wanted foundational equality. So that's equality in the eyes of the law, in line with natural rights. So foundational equality is things like everyone can vote, or everyone has the right to a fair trial, or like habeas corpus, or everyone has should be treated equally under the law. So so that's what foundational equality is. You'll see later that they have different kinds of equality as well. So liberals also place emphasis on the equality of opportunity. So early liberals believed that foundational equality would give people equality of opportunity. So basically we'd start to live in a meritocratic society. So people could, as long as they worked hard, essentially had the same opportunities as others. Okay. That said, liberals, in fact all liberals to a point, are okay with differing talents and outcomes. So say liberals think it's okay if certain people are cleverer and end up in more responsible jobs, or that certain people work harder and they will end up with more money or a bigger house and things like that. Okay, an example of this is William Gladstone. He was a Liberal Prime Minister in the 19th century, and he introduced competitive exams to the civil service instead of connections. So it used to be in the civil service, so if you worked in, I don't know, the Treasury or something like that, you would get that job because your father was the Earl of, I don't know, Wiltshire. I'm making this up, but you know what I mean. And he said, no, we actually want the best people for this position, so we're going to create exams and it'll be open to everyone. Mary Wollstonecraft also wanted, she fought for foundational rights for women, if you remember. So she said, oh, no, it's women are the same as men, and therefore should have equal opportunities in terms of those foundational rights, or those basic rights like right to vote and stuff like that. Particularly for her, she talked about property rights, didn't she? However, the extent of equality that liberals want has always been contested in a way. So on the next slide, we're going to look at a modern liberal, John Rawls' theory of justice. Can't remember why that popped up, but there it is, picture of a king. Okay. Okay, so John Rawls, a theory of justice. So what is this? So John Rawls, more than anything, was a philosopher, and he came up with this kind of thought experiment called the original position. Okay, so the thought experiment, it goes like this. The original position is a hypothetical state of affairs where one would not know the circumstances in which we were to be born into. So John Rawls asks us to imagine a society, or create a society in our head. and then imagine that we no longer are part of it, or that we die and then we come back, and you do not know what part of that society you will be born into, because he says that actually most of our decisions are made in a very biased way, so that we think things are fair because we're like, oh, I know that I worked hard and therefore I deserve this much, or whatever. So he says, no, we're going to be born, there we go, and we don't know where in the world or where in society we're going to end up. It's going to be a bit of a lottery, and we have to make sure that we'd be happy to be born into any part of that society. And he says if we do that, we will make up a more just society. Okay, so that's where his theory of justice comes from. He doesn't ask for complete equality, because he recognizes that people have different talents and people are more or less willing to work, etc., etc. So he says, but would you personally be happy to be born in any section of society with the chances that you would have from birth to make of what you will? Okay, and he says if we genuinely did that, we would end up with a better, more just society. Okay, and again we come up to that idea between liberals, between that kind of tension between how much equality do you want versus how much freedom you want. Okay, so liberals ultimately are the architects of liberal democracy. Okay, so what does that mean? We want free elections, we want limitations on power, so constitutionalism, and we want a respect for civil liberties, and we want our rights kind of enshrined, as it were. Okay, so if you think about it, all the things that we've looked at so far kind of point here, don't they? If you believe people are rational, then why not let them choose their leaders? If you believe in individualism, that people are important, then why not let each person have their say? Okay, and if you believe in freedom, then anyone can stand for election. All of the kind of foundations of liberalism kind of point in the direction of free and fair elections. And this is because of maybe one of the most important concepts, I suppose, maybe not the principles, but one of the most important concepts of liberalism. So this is called the social contract. So a few philosophers talked about this, but John Locke talked about it in particular, and he in his 2 treatises of government. So what he says is the social contract looks something like this. So basically, whereas there was no contract before, under the divine right of kings, kings could misuse their power, abuse their power, chuck people in jail, cut their heads off, and there was very little that people could or should do about it. Under the social contract, people essentially give kings their power. Okay, so they give kings their power like that, and then in turn, the government, it says kings here as well, but let's call it the government, protect people's rights. Okay, so it's kind of like a deal. So people say, okay, you can rule over us in return for the security that you give us. Okay, so we will give our consent in terms for security. If governments misuse that power, so that bottom red line, the people then have a right, or maybe even an obligation, to replace it or overthrow it, and that's done through democracy in the modern day. But Locke said that is a principle on which government should be run. So that. And that last one was not in place before. So people before should have respected the king no matter what the king did. But now, if the government abuses power, the people are sort of at liberty to step in and overthrow them. Now, actually, there's one little quite interesting caveat to this, because liberals, or at least early liberals, were quite concerned about excessive democracy, i.e., they were quite concerned that we could not only have the tyranny of a single individual, but we could also have something called tyranny of the majority. And he got a really interesting quote here from Thomas Jefferson, who is one of the founding fathers and the architect of one of the first constitutions, if not the first constitution in the world. And he says this: a democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49%. So what did they do? So the original founding fathers were confused by this problem. So they said, we want to give people power, but we don't want to give them too much power, in particularly because they're worried about people being uneducated or being swayed by manipulative speakers, okay, or manipulative persons. So actually the system of the Electoral College in the US was a buffer against the masses. So the Electoral College is a little bit like our first past the post system, right? And I'll just quickly explain how this works. So so imagine that you are Texas. Now Texas gets a certain amount of electoral college votes, and I can't remember how much it is, but let's call it 50. Okay, that's because Texas has a certain amount of population. So when they have a presidential election, people elect a certain amount of electoral college votes for Texas, and then those count towards the overall total of votes. So let's imagine there's another state like Alaska, and they only get 5 because hardly anyone lives there. Okay, so initially, nowadays, these voters just count as the total votes. Whoever wins the elections gets the most electoral college votes. So they count up the votes for Texas and Alaska and all the other states, and they work out who has more, Democrats or Republican, and that's it. But that's not how it used to work. So it used to work like these electors would literally be electors. So the 50 electors would be elected by Texas, and then they'd all go off to Washington, and they would use their judgment, not necessarily what the people had voted for. They would use their judgment to then elect the president. Okay, so can you see how the election used to be less direct than it was than it is today? And still today, you can get what we call faithless voters who not vote how they're supposed to, and stuff like that. So initially, they're quite worried about this. So actually, it's quite surprising. So liberals don't necessarily want direct democracy. You'd think they would, because they believe in rationality and they believe in the individual, but actually they're a bit scared about this kind of tyranny of the majority as well. So there's a kind of like quite a fine balancing point on exactly what liberal democracy they want, and generally they put, at least the early liberals would have preferred a representative democracy. Now you could argue maybe this is still a danger today. I mean, lots of people are uncomfortable with this idea because they say it gives too much weight to the opinions of the elite. But then lots of other people might look at recent votes, Brexit and all these things, and say actually the mob, as it were, can be a dangerous force as well. So that'll be something for you to sort of wrestle. Okay, let's go back to our original quote. So I started this sort of revision thing with a sentence from the Declaration of Independence. So it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So let's get a little highlighter here. So we hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay. Rationalism. Okay. That all men are created equal. Individualism. That we are endowed with certain unalienable rights. The idea of constitutionalism and limits to government. And among these, well, let's stay on this highlighter because this is some more rights here, aren't there? Are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what colour are we going to use for that? Now, actually, this, I would argue, is one of the most interesting things, because it actually says, what does that say? That basically humans are in a position not only to decide their own happiness, not only to pursue their own happiness, they haven't only got those foundational rights, that liberty to pursue their own happiness, but they're in a position to choose themselves what makes them happy. Okay, so that they are kind of rational, and this has been used many times. So it was the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It's also used by Abraham Lincoln, when he's arguing in his, I don't know my American history very well, but it's a very famous address. Is it the Gettysburg Address, where it's during the American Civil War, and he uses these words, to argue against slavery. I think it's used again in the by Dr. King in the Civil Rights Movement, or very similar speech. So there's a very famous passage which kind of argues, I think, very powerfully for liberalism. Okay, so let's have a little summary here. So this is what liberalism thinks. Let's made this nice and colourful for you. So in terms of human nature, liberalism really stresses the importance of the individual. In terms of human nature, it's generally positive, rational. It should be given. So humans are rational. They should be given responsibility. People should be free to make use of their talents and pursue happiness. However, and this isn't in the textbook, but in the summary in the textbook, but however, they also distrust human nature with power, and therefore access to it should be limited. Okay, so what do they think about the state? The state is a necessary evil, and that law is fundamental to freedom. All liberals distrust excessive power in the hands of the state and advocate constitutionalism. They see the state as rational and neutral arbiter between different groups, so kind of like in a pluralist society. However, they're split over the size and role of the state, with classical liberals wanting a night watchman state, and modern liberals advocating like a bigger, more interventionist state. In terms of society, we've got they all agree that freedom is essential to human and social well-being. Classical liberals argues that foundational equality is enough to protect the individual. So, i.e., equal legal rights is enough. As long as we are all equal in front of the law, then we need nothing, and we don't harm each other, then that's as far as we need to go. Modern liberals argue this is not enough to ensure social justice, and that basically humans must be given the chance to reach their potential and fulfill their talents, i.e., positive freedoms. Okay, and the last one. And I think we've done an essay on this. So classical liberals believe that when it comes to the economy, classical liberals believe that the economy should be free and left alone. That phrase laissez-faire. This will grant freedom to individuals, but also result in the most prosperity. Modern liberals argue that complete economic freedom brings misery. Do you remember if we did that? What is freedom if it's just freedom to starve? And basically, you can't trust the market to provide social justice. Therefore, state intervention is necessary to provide true freedom. Now, the last thing I want to add before the end of this is that essentially liberalism is interesting because liberalism won. Okay, so lots of people say, "Oh, I'm not a liberal. I hate liberals these days." Particularly in America, you hear a lot of that. Now, what's interesting is that actually you could argue, I think, that everything that the modern liberals thought has informed all of our other ideologies. So classical liberalism goes on to inform the right wing and neoliberalism and the new right and stuff like that. Modern liberalism goes in to inform the left wing and even to an extent sort of socialism and particularly the sort of modern left wing. So, and even you can argue that anarchism, some of the principles of freedom in individuals even went to inform, such more extreme ideologies like anarchism and stuff like that. So when it comes to sort of assessing liberalism and saying how much agreement there is, I think it's important to recognise, that the roots of liberalism are really everywhere in politics today. Thank you.